Have you ever made one small decision that changed everything she just wanted to dry off? One quiet moment on the top floor of a building where no one knew her name, and yet that moment, caught on a security camera, would unravel her world. Grace Whitaker wasn't looking for trouble. She was just trying to get by soaked from the rain, overworked, overlooked. But when a billionaire CEO saw her, not just her image, but the mark on her skin that echoed a story buried deep in his past, everything changed. What would you do if your most vulnerable moment was exposed, then tied to a legacy you never knew you belonged to? Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you stay and reclaim your name? This is not a story about scandal. It's about survival, dignity, and the quiet power of choosing to stay when the world expects you to disappear. A woman, a mistake, a past unearthed, and a choice that could inspire thousands to rise. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe that even the quietest voice can carry a legacy, and join us. As we begin the story of Grace Whitaker, it was supposed to be nothing, just 2 minutes, a quick stop to deliver a folder on the top floor of Langston Tower, a place so polished and quiet, it felt like the air itself whispered. Grace Whitaker never belonged in places like that. Not really. The elevator had hummed up 91 floors before opening with a soft chime. Rain had soaked through her thrift store blouse. Her shoes squished quietly against the marble as she stepped out. No one was around. Just silence, glass, and the faint scent of lavender polish. She held a folder tight against her chest paperwork for one of the executive assistants. She was told to drop it off before 6 p.m. Simple. Just get in, get out. But her hands were trembling from the cold, and the paper edges were curling from moisture. Just down the hallway, a side lounge sat open. No sign, no receptionist. Just a warm glow spilling out like a quiet invitation. She glanced left, then right. The hallway remained empty. She stepped inside. The room was soft, dim light against dark wood, a couch so untouched it looked staged. She dropped her backpack gently onto a chair and laid the folder on the coffee table. Then she peeled off her damp coat and stood there for a second, arms wrapped around herself, shivering. Her fingers hovered at the hem of her shirt. There was a small towel in her bag, and a dry change of clothes, a habit from growing up never knowing when she'd get wet, cold, or locked out again. Just for a second, she whispered. So she did. She pulled the shirt over her head, wiped herself quickly with the towel, and reached for the clean top tucked deep in her bag. No seduction, no drama, just a girl trying not to look like a drowned cat on her way to the subway. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that a camera, barely visible in the corner of the ceiling, had captured it all. It streamed live to a private security feed, a feed only one man had access to. And that night, for reasons he couldn't explain, Edward Langston was watching. Grace never thought much of herself. She was 25, finishing a public health internship she'd scraped together with night classes and triple shifts at the community center. She rented a room above a laundromat in Queens. Her life was routine early mornings, long subway rides, instant coffee, and dreams folded like laundry she'd never have time to iron out. She kept her head down, her shoes clean, her hopes small. She didn't see the camera. She didn't know who he was. And she certainly didn't know that moment, half-dressed, vulnerable, exhausted, was the moment that would rewrite her future. Edward Langston rarely checked the live feeds. He had people for that, protocols. Layers of security between him and the world. But that evening, as the rain pelted the city, and a power blip had triggered minor alerts across 3 floors, he'd tapped open his tablet without thinking. Activity. Floor 91. Unusual. He expected a maintenance worker, or maybe a late vendor. What he saw was a girl, small-framed, soaked to the bone, standing alone in the executive lounge, unaware of anything but the cold. Her movements were simple, practical. There was no vanity, no awareness of the camera, just fatigue. And then he saw it. As she leaned forward to dry her arms, her hair fell aside, just below her collarbone. Faint, but unmistakable, was a tattoo. A sun cradled in an open palm. His breath caught that symbol. It had once belonged to only one person. He didn't sleep that night. He watched the feed twice, then again, and once more after that, not with desire, not with guilt, but with a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. Recognition, not of the girl, but of the symbol, of a life he had buried long ago, of a promise he had once whispered over the grave, of a woman who had meant everything to him. Margaret Langston, his mother, the one who had built the Langston Care Foundation with hands tired from nursing shifts and a heart too generous for the corporate world, the one who used that very symbol for her final private scholarship cohort, a symbol never published, never shared, not even online, and now it lived, inked on the skin of a girl who just tried to get dry before going home. The next morning, Grace returned to her usual floor the 15th and went about her filing as always. But her name was already flagged in the system. By 10 a.m., a new email arrived. Reassignment, effective immediately. She had no idea what it meant, but Edward Langston had already made the call, and the story, though neither of them knew it yet, had already begun. Edward Langston had built an empire from silence. He was the kind of man whose name showed up in financial news, but never in tabloids. The kind whose photos were always from behind boardroom doors or beside check-sized donations, never smiling, rarely speaking. His voice was calm, precise, and when he did speak, people leaned in. Langston Corp. had started in steel, before pivoting to tech, then expanding into health systems and infrastructure. The world saw him as a strategist. Investors called him a shark. But behind closed doors, the man wasn't made of marble. He was made of ghosts. He had never been comfortable with noise. His apartment above the 91st floor of the tower was soundproofed on all sides. No ticking clocks, no television, only the hum of city life from a distance and the soft tap of polished leather shoes as he paced between long nights and longer reports. He lived alone, not because he couldn't have company, but because connection, for him, was always fleeting, always dangerous. Edward had lost his mother at 21. But the real loss began much earlier. Margaret Langston had been a nurse, a woman with gentle hands and a laugh that didn't fit in boardrooms. She'd founded the Langston Care Foundation with money she fought to carve out of her husband's cold empire, a man who believed charity was a waste unless it held tax returns. When Margaret died in a quiet hospice bed, Edward had been in his senior year at Princeton. He'd flown home and found the house quiet, the foundation folders boxed up, her records archived without ceremony. He remembered one thing from the funeral, a locket that had gone missing. A locket with a son cradled in an open palm. She used to say, "This symbol is hope it shines, even when held." It had been her way of marking every scholarship she gave, especially the hidden ones, the ones for girls no one wanted to notice, girls like Grace Whitaker. The symbol had haunted him ever since. He'd spent a decade trying to rebuild her foundation, funding clinics quietly, restoring the scholarship program under aliases and blind trusts. But the records from those final years, her personal files had vanished. It was as if someone didn't want them found. So when he saw it again, not in a drawer, not in an archive, but on the skin of a soaked intern in his building, he froze. Edward didn't speak of this to anyone, not to his assistant, not to the board, not even to the legal counsel who knew every inch of his holdings. Some truths were too soft to survive in a world of spreadsheets. Instead, he poured a bourbon that night and sat alone in the glass room above the city. He replayed the camera feed once more, pausing on the frame where she leaned forward, unaware. He zoomed in. The tattoo was faded, delicate, not flashy, not designed to be seen. It was placed exactly where Margaret used to wear her necklace, not on the wrist or shoulder, not for display. He leaned back, the bourbon untouched beside him. She couldn't have known what it meant, could she? The next day, he asked for her personnel file. Her name was Grace Whitaker, no known family. Applied through a community college referral and a blind scholarship fund, the Langston Public Aid Grant, one of his mother's original initiatives, restructured under a new name after her passing. She was one of the last to receive it before the program went dormant. That was all he needed to know. He didn't sleep much that night either, because for the first time in years, something cracked open inside him. Not longing, not guilt, but a quiet urgency, a thread that pulled from the past, right through his ribs, and maybe, just maybe. This was his second chance to understand what his mother had been trying to teach him all along. That morning, he made the call, no explanation, just 3 words: reassign Grace Whitaker. His assistant hesitated. To what department? Sir Edward didn't look up. Mine. He knew what it would look like. He knew people would talk. Some would assume vanity, others scandal. That a young woman being reassigned to the CEO's floor meant only one thing. But he didn't care, because this wasn't about headlines. It wasn't even about her, not yet. It was about the woman who once gave everything she had to strangers with no name, and the daughter of that belief, now unknowingly walking in her shadow. The elevator to the 91st floor opened with a soft hiss. Edward was already standing by the door when Grace arrived, blouse clean, hair pinned back, unsure whether to knock or run. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the small breath she took before raising her hand. He opened the door first. Their eyes met. She didn't know what was coming, and he wasn't sure what he was doing. But something in her posture, the careful way she stood, like she was used to being overlooked, shook something in him. Not attraction, not desire, recognition, like looking at a reflection in still water. Only time would tell what that meant. The office didn't feel like a place for questions. Grace Whitaker sat stiffly in the high-backed leather chair across from Edward Langston, unsure where to place her hands. The office was too quiet, too sleek, all dark wood, clean glass, and subtle hums of machinery she couldn't name. The kind of place that made you aware of every breath you took. She hadn't even had time to ask why she'd been transferred. The email had said it was a special internal initiative under the CEO's direction, nothing more. Her former supervisor offered a handshake and a half-smile that felt more like a farewell than congratulations. Now, she sat face-to-face with the most powerful man in the building, and he hadn't said a word in over a minute. Edward studied her like a man reading a page he wasn't sure he was ready for, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made Grace feel seen, more deeply than she wanted. Her voice cracked through the silence, soft but steady. "Sir, if I may, I'm not sure why I'm here." Edward looked away briefly, then turned back with that controlled tone of his. "I reviewed your file," he said simply. "You've worked in the archives longer than necessary for someone with your qualifications, and I believe your skill set is being underutilized." That was it. No smile, no further explanation. Grace nodded, her fingers knotting in her lap. "Thank you, sir." But inside, she was unraveling, because nothing about this made sense. The days that followed were quiet. Grace worked directly with Edward on philanthropic restructuring health initiatives, education proposals, infrastructure grants. It was the heart of the Langston Care Foundation, buried deep under years of mergers and bureaucracy. They spoke only when necessary. He gave instructions. She listened, asked questions where needed, and filed reports with a precision that surprised even her. But what unsettled her most wasn't the workload. It was the way he watched her, not constantly, not creepily, but intently, like he was waiting for something. Like her presence triggered a memory he hadn't figured out yet. On her 4th day in the office, Grace reached for a binder on the top shelf of the cabinet. The sleeve of her shirt slipped slightly, revealing the upper edge of her tattoo. She hadn't meant to show it. She rarely did. The tattoo wasn't decorative. It wasn't trendy. It had been done quietly at 19, after she'd aged out of foster care. She hadn't known what it meant at the time, not really. It was something her social worker had printed on a page during her final intake session. A sun cradled in an open palm. Below it, a single line in cursive, "You are seen." It had comforted her when no one else had, so she'd made it permanent. Now it was there, exposed for just a second, before her sleeve fell back into place. But Edward saw it. He stood across the room, mid-sentence. His voice faltered, his eyes fixed on her arm. She turned slowly, sensing the shift. "Is something wrong, sir?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice quieter than usual, he asked, "That symbol on your arm, Where did you get it? Grace paused. It was on a document. From my intake file, years ago. My social worker said it came from a fund that helped cover my school tuition. Edward stepped closer, not threatening, not intense, just searching. Do you remember the name of the fund? Grace thought back. It was called the Langston Public Aid Grant, I think. Silence stretched between them. Edward's breath grew shallow. He turned to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and took out a folder she hadn't seen before. Inside, aged paper, letters in a woman's handwriting, a photo black and white of a young nurse holding a child in her arms. Grace squinted. The woman looked familiar. Edward's voice returned, softer this time. That woman is my mother. Grace blinked. Oh, she was beautiful. She was also the founder of the original Langston Care Foundation, he added, before the company absorbed it, before my father dismantled it. Grace nodded slowly. She helped people like me, didn't she? She chose people like you, he said. Then, more quietly, and that symbol, the one on your arm, it was her personal mark. She designed it for a scholarship she ran privately. Only a few recipients ever received it. There are no public records left. Only fragments. Grace's throat tightened. So, that document, it came from her. Edward nodded. Grace looked down at her arm, then back at him. I never knew. I didn't either, Edward said. Not until I saw it. And for the first time, Grace saw him not as a CEO, but as a son. A man still haunted by the loss of someone who had loved deeply, even if the world didn't notice. They stood in that stillness, no spreadsheets, no agendas, just truth, quiet, unexpected. Grace's voice cracked as she whispered, I don't know why she chose me. Edward met her gaze, maybe because she saw something the world missed. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. But in that moment, something shifted. A space opened between them, not romantic, not yet, but something tender. Something built on shared loss, old scars, and a son cradled in a palm. And neither of them could look away. Grace Whitaker had never walked through a hallway so quiet. Each morning, the elevator hummed its way up to the 91st floor, and every time the doors opened, it felt like entering another world, one made not of noise and chaos, but of absence. No buzzing phones, no clattering keyboards, just stillness. It was unnerving at first. The floor housed only 2 offices, Edward Langston's, and a small adjacent room where Grace now worked. There were no other assistants, no chatter, just her, a stack of reports, and the man whose presence seemed to make the air thinner. He didn't hover, he didn't micromanage, but he noticed everything. Edward Langston had always preferred solitude. For years, he'd carved out this floor to serve as both office and refuge. Few dared visit without appointment. Fewer still were invited in. But now Grace was here. At first, she didn't speak unless spoken to. She reviewed documents, organized grant data, and tracked old project leads. She kept to her desk and kept her voice even. Still, she felt the tension that hung between them. Not romantic, not flirty, something deeper, like standing on the edge of something not yet named. One Thursday afternoon, just past 4, Edward called her into his office. She stepped in, notebook in hand, ready to take notes. But he wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city as rain streaked down the glass. You're efficient, he said, not turning. Grace blinked. Thank you, sir, but you're also holding back. She hesitated. Sir. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. You don't ask questions. You don't push. You don't even seem curious why you're here. Grace's grip tightened around the notebook. I figured if I waited long enough, someone would tell me. Edward walked toward his desk, sat down, and gestured to the chair opposite. Ask me. Grace paused, then sat. She kept her eyes on the notepad, then looked up. Why did you reassign me? He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, because I saw something I couldn't ignore. Grace swallowed. The tattoo. Yes. She waited. And I don't believe in coincidence. Grace. Not anymore. Her voice was barely a whisper. Do you believe in fate? He looked at her directly. I believe in recognition. In the moments when something lost comes back. Not how you expected, but exactly when you need it. The silence stretched. Grace lowered her gaze. I didn't know about your mother, or what that symbol meant. I believe you. She met his eyes, surprised by the softness in his tone. For a man known for closing deals and freezing negotiations, it felt strange. She stood then, too overwhelmed to sit still. May I ask another question, she said, facing the bookshelves. Go ahead. Why didn't you say something when you saw it? The tattoo, Edward leaned back, folding his arms. Because I wasn't sure what it meant, not just to me, but to you. And I didn't want to touch something sacred. Grace turned slightly. It wasn't sacred when I got it. I just needed something that made me feel seen. And now I think, maybe it was left there for a reason. She didn't know why she said it, but it felt true. From that day forward, something shifted. They didn't talk more, but the silence between them no longer felt stiff. It felt charged, like a space holding its breath. Grace began to notice the small things, the way Edward's jaw tensed when reading reports about slashed healthcare funding, the way his voice dropped when discussing projects related to pediatric clinics, the way his hand paused over his mother's old notes, not out of confusion, but reverence. And he noticed her too. The way she adjusted her sleeves before entering meetings, the way she always arrived 5 minutes early, even when no one else would know, the way she placed her palm lightly on every stack of papers, as if grounding them before letting them go. One night, long past office hours, Grace stayed behind to finish digitizing old grant records. Edward walked in, surprised to see the light still on. You're still here, he said. She smiled tiredly. The database is outdated. I'm rewriting tags. He stood there for a moment, then stepped closer. These were my mother's files, he said. I didn't even know they still existed. They were buried under layers of reorganizations, Grace replied, forgotten, like the girls she once helped. Edward didn't speak. Instead, he stepped beside her and looked at the screen. Line after line of names. Most were unreadable. Some had notes beside them, chronic asthma, single parent, abuse survivor. He let out a slow breath. She used to say the system was designed to forget the people. It couldn't help fast enough. Grace nodded. She wasn't wrong. They stood in that dim office, two people from opposite worlds, reading the same names and feeling the same ache. As the elevator doors closed behind them that night, Grace felt a weight she couldn't name settle over her, not fear. Not confusion. Something else. A knowing. That she was no longer just an intern, and he was no longer just her boss. They were pieces of a puzzle long separated, now sliding quietly into place. And neither of them could explain why it mattered so much, but they knew it did. The office felt different that morning. Grace Whitaker arrived earlier than usual. The rain had returned overnight, painting the city in gray. Her hair was still damp at the edges as she shook off her coat and placed it neatly over the back of her chair. Edward wasn't in yet. The hum of machines was the only sound that greeted her. She walked to the coffee corner, poured herself a cup dark, no sugar, then sat down at her desk, preparing for another day of reports and edits. The tablet on Edward's desk was still lit, its screen facing slightly toward her. Normally, she wouldn't have looked, but something was moving. She glanced up. A blinking notification sat in the corner, security feed floor 91, lounge archive. She froze. The words weren't alarming on their own, just another building system, probably, but her stomach tightened. Something was off. She stood, hesitated, then stepped quietly to the desk. The tablet hadn't locked. Her fingers hovered, uncertain, before she tapped the screen. It opened a folder labeled Internal Lounge, April 18, 7:42 p.m. Her breath caught. That was the night she'd come up to deliver the folder. The night it had rained, the night she'd stepped into the side lounge and she tapped again. The video loaded, and there she was, a still frame, her shirt halfway up, body turned slightly, face unaware. Her throat tightened as her eyes locked onto her own image. She could barely breathe. There was no sound, no commentary, just the silent footage of a moment that wasn't meant to be witnessed, a moment she'd thought was private, necessary, harmless. Her fingers fumbled across the screen. She backed away. No. The air felt colder now. Her hands shook as she turned off the tablet. Her pulse raced in her ears, drowning out everything else. She didn't notice Edward enter until he spoke. Grace. His voice was low, puzzled. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide, wounded. You watched it, she said. Edward blinked, took a step forward. You watched me, she repeated, her voice cracking. You knew I was in there, and you didn't say a word. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. I trusted this place, she said, each word like a pin to the heart. I thought I earned my way here. I worked. I didn't flirt. I didn't ask for anything. I just wanted to matter. Edward's voice was rough when he finally found it. You do matter. Then why didn't you delete it? Silence. The kind that says too much. She backed away, as if the space between them had suddenly grown sharp. Her voice dropped into something far more dangerous than anger. I thought this place saw me for my mind, my work. But you saw that moment, and instead of erasing it, you reassigned me. Edward shook his head, his voice pleading now. It wasn't like that. Then tell me, she whispered. Tell me what it was. But he couldn't. Not in that moment, because the truth, the real truth, wasn't simple. It wasn't about voyeurism. It wasn't about control. It was about recognition, about the sudden eruption of something sacred in a space he hadn't known still held feeling. But saying that now would only sound like an excuse. And Grace wasn't asking for excuses. She was asking why he broke her trust. She didn't come to work the next day, or the day after. HR sent a polite inquiry. She didn't respond. Her desk sat untouched, her files neatly stacked. But her chair remained empty, like a silence that echoed louder with every passing hour. Edward felt it. Not in his routine that remained impeccable, but in the way his hands lingered over her reports, the way his eyes drifted to the door every time the elevator dinged. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. She hadn't been hurt. The video was secure. No one else had seen it. But the truth was heavier than logic, because in that moment, when she had looked at him, it wasn't fear he saw. It was betrayal. By the end of the week, he couldn't take it anymore. He called a contact in legal, a friend who owed him more than one favor, asked for Grace's updated department assignment, found out she'd returned to her original floor quietly, without a word. She'd tucked herself back into the background, trying to disappear. Edward didn't wait. Against every protocol, he took the elevator down. He found her by the file cabinets, her back to him, organizing reports like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been broken just days before. Grace. She turned sharply. Her expression hardened, professional, but her eyes couldn't lie. They were red, tired, still raw. He stepped forward, but she didn't move. Instead, she held her ground. Please, she said. Don't. He didn't speak right away. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was a USB and a signed affidavit. The file is gone, he said. This is proof. She stared at it, unmoving. Why did you keep it in the first place? Edward's jaw clenched. His voice, when it came, was stripped of power. Because that night, you reminded me of someone I thought I'd never see again. She frowned, confused. My mother, he added, and that one word cracked something open. The conversation that followed was not romantic. It wasn't redemptive. It was fragile. Edward explained everything, the symbol, the scholarship, the lost records, the connection he hadn't dared to believe, and Grace listened, Not because she forgave him, but because she needed to understand. And in that quiet moment between two people lost, in a building too big for feelings, something began to heal. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. The bench at Bryant Park was cold. Grace Whitaker pulled her coat tighter around her as she stared down at the paper cup in her hands. The coffee inside had long gone lukewarm, but she hadn't moved, not in 20 minutes. She needed the noise of the city, the sound of children chasing pigeons, the hum of taxis, the clink of ceramic cups from the cafe across the street, because silence had begun to feel like betrayal. She didn't hear him until he sat beside her. Edward Langston didn't speak at first. He sat just close enough to share the bench, but far enough to respect the space between them. He looked straight ahead, not at her. She didn't flinch this time, but her voice was flat. "You found me. I needed to," he replied. A long pause, then softly. "I know who you are now, Grace. Not just the girl on the camera, not just the intern." She turned slowly, brows drawn. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn folder. Inside were documents aged by time, some folded neatly, others creased by years of being moved, misplaced, almost forgotten. He placed it on her lap gently. "Read the letter," he said. Her fingers hesitated. Then she opened the folder. At the top was a single page, written in elegant cursive, a letter. The ink slightly faded. The date was 12 years ago. "Dear M. Her name is Grace. I saw her at the shelter last week. She doesn't speak much, but she watches everything. I recognize that silence. I lived in it once. She reminds me of the girls I wished someone had saved earlier. She's smart, sharp, but guarded. I want to give her a chance, not just with books or money, but with belief. She's not ready to be told she's special, but one day she will need to hear it. Fund her future, quietly. No spotlight, just the road. Give her the sun in the palm. She'll understand it when the time is right." Grace read the letter twice. Her hands were shaking by the time she finished. "I don't remember her," she whispered. "I was too young." "She remembered you," Edward said. "I never knew anyone cared. Not really." "She did." Grace stared at the words again, as if trying to climb inside them. Her breath fogged the cold air. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "I always thought that scholarship came from some faceless foundation. I never knew there was a woman behind it, that she saw me, chose me." Edward's voice dropped. She never forgot the people she helped, even when her own foundation was stripped away. "And now you're trying to rebuild it," Grace said softly. He didn't answer, but the silence said enough. She looked up at him then, not with accusation, not with anger, but with something else entirely. A strange, aching recognition. "You didn't have to tell me all this," she said. "You could have let it go." Edward shook his head, "But it wouldn't have let go of me." Grace closed the folder gently. "I was angry," she admitted, "not just because of the video, but because I thought you were like the others. Men who see power as permission." He flinched, just slightly. "But you're not," she added. "You're something else. Something harder to read." "And what do you read now?" he asked quietly. Grace looked at him. Her eyes held questions, but also clarity. "I think you're someone who's been carrying grief so long. You forgot it could soften." Edward inhaled deeply. "Losing her changed everything," he said. "And for a while, I thought keeping my distance would protect her legacy. But distance doesn't protect anything," Grace said. "It just keeps you from healing." Their eyes locked. There was no music, no dramatic lines, just two people finally seeing each other, really seeing without fear. They walked back to the building side by side, not close, not touching, but in step. At the lobby, Edward paused before the elevators. "Would you consider returning to the 91st floor?" he asked. Grace hesitated. "I'm not ready to forget what happened. I'm not asking you to. I'll need boundaries. You'll have them. And trust won't be automatic," she added. "Understood." She looked up at him, and for the first time in days, her shoulders relaxed. Then I'll think about it. The next morning, she was back. No announcement, no grand welcome, just her familiar steps echoing through the marble hallway. She placed her bag beside the desk, booted up her system, and began working like nothing had happened. But something had, and it showed. In the way Edward's voice softened, in the way Grace looked him in the eye now, not with awe or fear, but with equal ground. They were no longer boss and assistant. They were something else. Two survivors of different storms, both carrying pieces of the same woman's legacy, and neither could ignore that truth anymore. Grace Whitaker had thought the worst was behind her. That morning, she walked into Langston Tower with the resolve to move forward to matter again. She sat at the 91st floor desk, heart steadying itself, edits, reports, philanthropy files, order in the routine. But the world outside was shifting. By midday, rumors rippled through the halls. She heard them first in whispers, staffers exchanging startled glances, fingers hovering over water coolers, voices low. "Did you see that Grace? On social media. Leak." Each word stung more than she'd expected. She returned to her desk. The tablet was gone, replaced with a secure laptop she didn't recognize. But on the lock screen, a blurred still of her clothes half pulled up, surveillance layout visible. Someone had leaked it. Her breath halted. Edward arrived just before 12:05. He found Grace standing behind her chair, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the screen. He closed the door behind him. The click echoed in the silence. Grace didn't look at him. She pressed her lips together, shoulders trembling. She whispered, "It's out." He nodded. "Who?" she asked. He shook his head. "No idea." She closed the laptop with deliberate calm. "Then I know who." She looked at him now. "Does the board know?" Edward's jaw tightened. "I've notified security. We're doing everything we can." She turned from him, gaze lost in the window's reflection raindrops making soft trails down glass. "It's not enough," she said softly. "I'm exposed." Social media had exploded. Grace Whitaker began trending. Langston scandal, a hashtag carousel. The comments were brutal, compassion nearly gone, the curation of sympathy drowned. She felt them angry men mocking her, outrageous voices amplifying shame, good people whispering. Was she up to something? Was she? Edward returned home that night, hands clenched. He rarely showed emotion, but tonight. He paced, 15 steps across marble, 11 back. He stopped at the window, city lights below. He didn't see them. He saw only Grace unheard, unseen, betrayed. By morning, the damage was clear. The foundation's public trust rating wavered, sponsors froze contributions, shares dipped, travel announcements for upcoming health project launches were postponed indefinitely. And Grace, he found her in a junior staff office on the 15th floor. She'd returned to where the internship began. But today, she sat splayed in a guest seat, trembling as she tried to explain what happened to a sympathetic operations manager. Edward watched for a moment, then stepped in. He raised his hand. "Excuse me." All eyes turned. He knelt beside Grace. He spoke slowly. "Grace and I have reviewed the situation. This footage is deeply private, unauthorized. I apologize. This does not reflect our standards or my values. Grace is a valued contributor to Langston Corp." He paused. Her name sounded like a promise on his lips. He turned to the manager. "Please dismiss her. She will continue work with me." By afternoon, the news had quieted, but only slightly. The images were still everywhere. But something had shifted. His statement made people pause. It had undercut the flood. His presence in defense of her gave it weight. Grace watched, numb. Edits done, but update pending. Her voice was still, inside. However, turmoil raged. Shame bore down. But anger and something else found footing. She wanted answers, and she wanted change. That evening, Edward invited her to his office at 6 p.m. She arrived punctually. He offered tea chamomile, sugarless, gently warm. They sat in companionable silence as the city lights flickered outside. An hour passed. She cleared her throat. What now? Her voice was low. Do we just wait until they find someone else to scapegoat? Edward took a breath. We fight. We expose the leak. He turned his head toward the city. Privacy is real. Power doesn't undo damage. We need accountability. She nodded slowly. In his words, resolve. He wrote, I'll track the chain, he said, and I have a team doing it as we speak. Grace searched his gaze. He saw it. Then his eyes darkened. More than that, he whispered. We need to lead with transparency. The Foundation will testify. Offer amendments to our policy. Invite third-party auditors. We'll show we stand on the right side of this. Grace felt a tremor of hope, but something unsettled her. During the weekend, she struggled with decisions. Public statement, lawsuit, withdrawal. Nothing felt right. She took the letter Edward's mother wrote. It lay on her coffee table. She read it again. You'll understand it when the time is right. Maybe this was the moment. By Monday, they released a joint statement. Dear all, this weekend, a deeply personal video of me was shared without permission. I was violated. The image alone does not define me, but the breach of trust does. Langston Corp. condemns this violation. We will pursue legal actions against all individuals or systems involved. We are also launching a privacy review committee, chaired by myself and Ms. Whitaker, to ensure such misuse never happens again. Thank you for your support and understanding. Edward Langston and Grace Whitaker. Social sentiment wavered. A pause. Sympathy returned. Board meetings later praised transparency. Contributors pledged renewed support. Shares began slowly rebounding. In a quiet moment that evening, Grace returned to the 91st floor. She found Edward leaning over the old file cabinet, Margaret's initial charity yellow binders. He looked up when she entered. Her voice was measured. I want this committee to focus on those who lost their voices, those who never had a platform to speak after privacy was breached, because there are people just like me without power. We need them to know someone sees them. Edward nodded solemnly. In his eyes, she recognized belonging and purpose. That night, Grace finally exhaled. The echo of fear still pulsed, but also the first drops of purpose. The wind was cruel that morning. It swept down from the Hudson with a sharpness that stung Grace Whitaker's cheeks as she stood outside Langston Tower. She stared up at the glass facade, clean, perfect, and utterly indifferent, and asked herself the question that had followed her for days. Do I still belong here? She hadn't answered it yet. Her name was still floating through news feeds. The video had been blurred in every repost, but it didn't matter. The image, the insinuation, they were enough to stain her reputation, to rewrite her effort into a single humiliating frame. The public apology helped, but it didn't erase the stares. It didn't silence the questions in the elevator. It didn't change the fact that every glance now came with an invisible caption, "That's her." And yet, she returned, not because she felt brave, but because she refused to let shame make her small. Edward Langston watched from the 91st floor, arms crossed. He didn't hover. He didn't reach out unless invited. But when she stepped through the private office door that morning, he stood from his chair. "Good morning," he said. Grace met his gaze, firm and measured. "I'm staying," she replied. "But not just to work. I want this to mean something." His brow lifted, curious. "I don't want to survive this. I want to redefine it." He nodded once, slowly. "Then let's begin." They restructured the internal privacy protocols first. Then they met with legal, HR, and communications, crafting new onboarding materials centered on consent, security ethics, and whistleblower protection. Grace insisted on being in every meeting not as a victim, but as a stakeholder. She asked the questions no one else thought to ask. Who monitors the monitors? Who has override access? What happens when the system is weaponized? Her voice was calm, but unrelenting. Edward respected that, more than anyone knew. He watched as she stepped into rooms of suits and consultants and carried herself like someone who had earned the floor, because she had. But it wasn't easy. Each night, she sat on her couch, reading headlines that still called her the intern. not the survivor, not the advocate, just a girl whose privacy had been stolen and replayed. Her fingers hovered over the delete button on her social media apps more than once, but she didn't press it. She let them see her. Because that was the only way to make them listen. One evening, Grace found Edward sitting alone in the Foundation's conference room, documents spread across the table, blueprints. She stepped closer. Hospital plans, she asked. He nodded. The Evelyn Langston Center. It was always supposed to be more than a building. It was her dream, a place for women, for children, for anyone whose stories never made the headlines. He looked up at her. She wanted to build something that stayed, even when the world forgot. Grace sat beside him, scanning the plans. She would have wanted this. I hope so, he said quietly. I didn't understand it until now. She tilted her head. What changed? He looked at her. You. The confession hung in the air, not like a pickup line, but like a revelation. Grace didn't smile. She didn't look away. She just said, then let's make sure the next girl who walks into that clinic doesn't have to survive a scandal to be seen. Edward nodded. They worked until midnight, but the pressure outside continued. Journalists showed up again. One cornered Grace as she left a conference on ethics and digital privacy. His tone was sharp. Miss Whitaker, do you regret being involved with Mr. Langston? She paused. Do you consider yourself a spokesperson for women's rights, or just a cautionary tale? She looked him dead in the eye. I consider myself someone who knows what it means to be hurt and still show up. You can call that whatever you want. I call it living. The video went viral, not for shock value, but for honesty. And slowly, people started listening. In private, the board questioned Edward's judgment. They asked if he was risking too much by keeping Grace involved. One member even suggested quietly placing her in an off-site role until the situation cooled down. Edward didn't flinch. You want to erase her because you're uncomfortable with her resilience. He said, I won't do that. They didn't ask again. The next week, Grace stood before a classroom of interns, speaking about digital rights and professional boundaries. She didn't mention the video. She didn't have to. She spoke with calm, with depth, and with the authority of someone who had walked through fire and come out carrying water for others. Afterward, one intern, a quiet girl from Jersey City, stayed behind. She looked at Grace and said, Thank you for not leaving. Grace smiled gently. I almost did. What made you stay? Grace looked out the window at the city below. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. That night, as the sun set behind the skyline, Grace and Edward stood side by side in the upper office. No words, just silence, shared. Grace turned to him. I'm not afraid anymore. He didn't ask her why. He only said, Good, because we've only just started. It started with a headline. Langston intern tied to juvenile theft case. Who is Grace Whitaker, really? The article hit just after dawn. By the time Grace Whitaker opened her inbox, it had already been forwarded 6 times once from a staffer who added only, You okay? She didn't reply. She just clicked the link and read. Her chest tightened with every sentence. The reporter had dug deep, too deep. He'd found sealed juvenile files, old police notes from when she was 15, a convenience store, a backpack full of food she hadn't paid for. No charges were filed, no court appearance, just one line buried at the end of the report, likely survival-related theft, no evidence of repeated behavior. She had forgotten about it, or maybe buried it. She'd been hungry. Edward Langston found out minutes later. He was in a meeting with the legal team when the alert popped up on his screen. The article was plastered across several digital news outlets. It had been shared by a fringe investor blog, then picked up by a local paper looking for controversy. The timing wasn't accidental. Just 2 days earlier, Grace had been offered a permanent role at the Langston Foundation, a leadership track, not just a title. Someone was trying to dismantle her. And this time, Edward could feel the rage simmering beneath his carefully composed surface. Grace didn't show up that morning. By noon, Edward was at her apartment. He knocked. No answer. He called. No response. He waited, standing in the hallway of the old brick building in Queens, rain falling again, just like that first night. When she finally opened the door, she looked like someone trying to hold the weight of 2 lifetimes. He said nothing at first. She stepped aside and let him in. "I didn't tell you," she said. "You didn't have to. They'll think it defines me." "What do you think?" She sat on the couch, curled into herself. I'm tired of having to explain that survival isn't always clean, that people who end up in the system don't start out wrong, they just start out small." Edward nodded slowly. "Then say that." She looked up. "They won't listen." He sat beside her, calm but unwavering. "Then say it louder." That evening, she wrote a statement, not for PR, not for damage control, just truth. It read, "I was 15. I was hungry. I took food I couldn't pay for. It didn't make me a thief. It made me human. I've spent every day since then trying to build a life I can be proud of, not perfect, just real. If that past disqualifies me in your eyes, so be it. But it won't disqualify me in mine." Edward read it. He signed it. Together, they released it. It went viral, but not like before. This time, the comments were different. People shared stories of growing up in shelters, of stealing diapers, tampons, baby formula, not to rebel, but to survive. Grace had said what many had never dared. She didn't ask for pity. She demanded dignity. In the boardroom the next day, the discussion was tense. A senior advisor asked whether it was wise to keep her in such a public-facing role. Edward stood. "Let me be clear," he said. "If you can't see her value because of what she survived, then you don't belong in this foundation." No one spoke after that. Grace returned to work with a quieter strength. No makeup, hair tied back, no need to dress like she was apologizing for taking up space, and the team. They followed her lead. Even the interns straightened their backs. She had changed the tone of the place not by shouting, but by staying. One night, Edward found her reviewing scholarship applications in the conference room. She didn't notice him at first. He watched her gently highlight essay lines from girls who had grown up the same way she had, in chaos, in closets, in corners of apartments that weren't really theirs. He finally spoke. "You're not just surviving this," he said. "You're redefining it." She looked up, eyes tired but steady. "And what if they come after me again? Then we stand again." She exhaled, and again after that, his voice was quiet, steady. "Yes." Later that week, they announced a new scholarship initiative not in Margaret Langston's name, but in Grace's. It was controversial. Critics called it a publicity stunt. Supporters called it overdue. Grace didn't care, because the name on the banner wasn't about her ego. It was about legacy and the right to rise. The sky was weeping again. Rain fell in steady lines outside the tall windows of the Evelyn Langston Community Hospital. Inside, Grace Whitaker stood beneath the soft glow of new lights, fingers brushing the polished edge of the reception counter. The building smelled of paint, pine, and possibility. It was opening day. The first in a series of women's and children's wellness centers Edward Langston had promised to fund, and the first one named not after a corporation, but after a mother. Grace looked down at her name tag, Director of Advocacy and Outreach. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself, not because the name was wrong, but because, for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by fear. She wasn't hiding anymore. Edward arrived a few minutes later, dressed not in a suit, but a soft gray sweater and slacks that made him look like a man, not a CEO. He walked the corridor slowly, as if savoring the silence before the crowds came. When he reached her, he paused, looked around. "You did this," he said. Grace shook her head gently. "We did." He studied her face, then added, "You know, she would have loved this. My mother. She believed in spaces like this where people didn't have to prove their pain to be helped." "She believed in me," Grace said quietly. Edward's eyes softened. "She still does." The first patients arrived just after 9. A young woman with a toddler, an older woman with shaking hands, a teenage girl wearing the same wary eyes Grace had worn at 15. Grace greeted them with quiet dignity. She gave tours, introduced the nurses, explained the intake process. No fanfare, just presence. She didn't need to be the face of anything. She only needed to be there. Around midday, rain began to fall harder. A reporter asked Grace if she'd like to do an interview inside. She shook her head. She stepped out into the covered walkway and looked up at the gray sky, letting the smell of rain on concrete bring her back to that first day soaked clothes, camera overhead, uncertainty, how far she had come, how far she had walked. Later that evening, when the patients had gone and the building quieted, she sat alone in the nurses' lounge, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Edward found her there. He didn't speak at first. He just sat beside her. Then, slowly, he asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to that floor?" She thought for a moment. "Every day. And I think I would have kept surviving, quietly, but I wouldn't have known what it meant to be seen." Edward nodded. "And me, I would have kept building without remembering why." They both smiled, gently, not in triumph, but in truth, outside. The rain eased. Grace stood, walked to the window, and touched the glass lightly. "Do you think people will forget?" she asked. Edward joined her. "No," he said, "but that's not always a bad thing." She looked at him, puzzled. "They'll remember you stood up," he added, "that you didn't vanish when it would have been easier." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was another letter, handwritten. Margaret's words. "If you ever meet her, tell her this. The world may bruise you, may forget you, but if you keep walking anyway, you will become a lighthouse for others. That's what you are. A light." Grace's throat tightened. "I wasn't ready to be a light. You became one anyway." They stood in silence again, side by side. No promises, no confessions, just understanding. That two people can carry grief and still build hope. That the world can break you and you can still rebuild something better. As they turned to leave, Grace looked back once more at the quiet lobby, the warm lights, the worn floor tiles that would soon be filled with hurried footsteps and stories in the making. And she whispered, more to herself than to him, "This is what redemption really looks like. Sometimes, the quietest stories carry the loudest truths." Grace Whitaker's journey reminds us that dignity isn't given, it's reclaimed. In a world that often shames those who fall, this story gently insists we are more than our worst moment. Many of us, especially with age, carry regrets, hidden scars, or chapters we'd rather forget. But like Grace, we can choose to stand, not in defiance, but in understanding that our past doesn't disqualify us from purpose. It prepares us for it. The story also speaks to those who feel unseen, that even in silence, you matter, that small acts of truth, of staying ripple louder than we know, and perhaps most powerfully. It reminds us that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet walk into a room you once feared, a letter from the past, a hand reached, not in rescue, but in recognition. Let this story be a soft reminder you are never too late to matter, never too old to rise, and never too broken to rebuild something beautiful. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a quiet place in your heart, or simply reminded you that you're not alone, we hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt, meaningful stories to life for you, and for those who need them most. Until next time, stay kind, stay human.